Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers. I'm Jim Papandrea. This podcast is a production of Catholic Culture. Sign up for our newsletter at catholicculture.org/newsletter. Today we continue our interim series with one of our mothers of the Church, Egeria the Pilgrim. As long as Christianity was an illegal, persecuted religion, it was virtually impossible for Christians to travel to visit the places where Jesus and the apostles had walked and taught, and where Jesus had been crucified and was raised and ascended. But with the legalization of Christianity in the early 4th century, that made Christian travel possible. For one thing, it made it possible to have an ecumenical council, since now the bishops could travel from across the whole universal church and come to one place to meet in council. But it also made it possible for Christians to visit the holy places and travel to where they could stand on holy ground. One of the first people to go on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land was Saint Helena, the mother of the Emperor Constantine. She identified the locations of the significant events in the life of Jesus, especially the place of his crucifixion and the place of his burial, his tomb, which of course is also the place of his resurrection. And then she and her son, the emperor, commissioned the building of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over both the Hill of Calvary, Golgotha, and the tomb. But we only know about St. Helena from what was written about her after the fact. However, later in the 4th century, another important woman made a pilgrimage, and her name was Egeria, or in some manuscripts, Etheria, and she kept a diary. Did you ever wonder about the origin of pilgrimages, or the Stations of the Cross, or even the very concept of certain places being holy ground? Well, we're going to talk about all of that in this episode of The Way of the Fathers. Egeria was, or must have been, a very wealthy woman. She was able to embark on a 3-year or more pilgrimage with an entourage that included friends and servants. Sometimes she is said to have been a nun, or even the abbess of a convent, because when she wrote home, she addressed her letters to her sisters. But the money she must have spent on this pilgrimage, and the way that the people in Jerusalem treated her like a dignitary, all of that tells us that she was probably not a member of any religious community that would have required a vow of poverty. She might have been one of those very wealthy Christian widows who turned her estate into a home for a community of women, like the mother of the Cappadocian Fathers, Saints Basil and Gregory, did. And if that were true, she might have been the spiritual leader of a group of women. And so, when she writes to her sisters, we don't really know whether that means biological siblings or spiritual sisters. In any case, she was probably a wealthy widow who, like some of the other wealthiest people in the Roman Empire, had inherited the fortunes of 2 wealthy families, her own and her husband's. And so she decided to spend a significant part of her wealth on this pilgrimage. And in about the years 381 to 384 AD, she left her native Spain and ventured out on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. She would have been in Jerusalem during the time that St. Cyril of Jerusalem was the bishop there, and she talks about meeting the monks who were there. Now remember, this is only the late 4th century, and already there are monks in Jerusalem giving tours to pilgrims. They would show a person or group around, take them to the important sites, and conduct liturgies there. Specifically, when it came to Holy Week, there would be a liturgy at each of the sites of significant moments leading up to Christ's Passion. There would be processions from one place to the next, starting on the Mount of Olives and the Garden of Gethsemane, and all leading up to Mass at the new Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre. And in the writings of Egeria, she describes all of this in great detail. In fact, what we call her diary is really fragments of the letters that she wrote home to her sisters, in which she describes her experiences, seeing the sights, and more important, going to Mass and attending liturgies at the holy sites. Now, we don't know much about Egeria herself, only what I've already told you. But most of what we know about Jerusalem in the 4th century, not only its topography, but also its liturgy, comes from Egeria. And pilgrims like her brought home the liturgical customs from Jerusalem, and those customs spread around the world. This includes the development of the lectionary, because it was in Jerusalem where we first see the concept of specific scripture readings appropriate to a particular place on a particular day. Egeria wrote this: "For this was very much our custom, that, whenever we should come to places that I had desired to visit, the proper passage from Scripture should be read." In another place, she wrote, "Whenever we were empowered to reach our destination, it was always our custom first to say a prayer, then to read a passage from the Bible, sing a psalm fitting the occasion, and finally saying a second prayer." And so we see the development of liturgies written for the commemoration of specific events. But now let's take a step back and look at how the very idea of a pilgrimage began. Very early in the Church's history, the doctrine of the resurrection came under fire. Not only Jesus' resurrection, but also the hope that we will all, with him, be raised bodily as well. That our bodies are an essential part of our personhood, and that our bodies are not just shells to be discarded, but rather that we are to be redeemed as whole persons, spirit and body. But the pagan philosophers questioned this doctrine, which made the early apologists like Justin Martyr and Athenagoras and later church fathers, including one of our church mothers, St. Macrina, explain and defend the doctrine of the resurrection. And that included the belief that the body that will be raised is the same body we have now, redeemed and transformed for a spiritual realm, certainly, but the same bodies. We will be the same person we are now. St. Macrina went so far as to say that our souls will watch over every atom of our bodies until they are raised and reunited. The point is that there is an eternal and unbroken connection between a soul and its body, even when they are temporarily separated by death. So, what does this have to do with pilgrimages? As we read in the account of the martyrdom of Polycarp, Polycarp's bones were retrieved by the Christian community in Smyrna, and they were kept in a special place where they could be visited and venerated. And in fact, it was the very presence of the relics of a martyr that made a place holy ground. This is, in part, because of that connection between the human remains, and the word relic is just the Latin word for remains, the connection between the remains or the relics and the spirit or the soul of a martyr. That soul is in paradise, in the presence of Christ, and that martyr or other saint has the ear of the Lord to intercede for us. And so, to be close to the saint's physical remains here on earth is to be close to the saint in heaven, and therefore closer to Jesus. So, anywhere where there is the tomb of a martyr or other saint, that is holy ground. The relics make the place holy. And if there was a martyr from your town who was buried nearby, you would go to the tomb at least once a year on the anniversary of the death, and you would be on holy ground, in a holy place, in what the Celtic Christians called a liminal space, a place where the veil between this life and the next is thinner. And there you would pray and ask for the intercession of the saints, and you would chant the psalms and sing some songs and hear scriptures read, and you would hear again the story of the martyrs and their victories over death. This practice of having what amounts to a picnic with a liturgy at the tomb of a saint was in one sense just the continuation of a Roman tradition called the refrigerium, the memorial meal. But for the Christians, it often included a mass, and in some cases, the lid of a sarcophagus functioned as the table of the Eucharist. In Rome, when the relics were moved from the catacombs into the city, they consecrated the altars of the basilicas, and this developed into the tradition that every altar should have relics in it. Every altar should be also a tomb because of our hope of the resurrection and our conviction that the Mass is a foreshadowing of the heavenly banquet. So Christian pilgrimage begins with the desire to celebrate Mass on holy ground. But what if there was no saint buried near your town? Or what if you had a devotion to a particular saint who was buried farther away? Well, then you made a road trip, and pilgrimage as we know it was born. Now, as I mentioned, in the 4th century, pilgrimage to the Holy Land became possible, but it was still very expensive and very dangerous. And later, with the Islamic invasion, it became even more dangerous. So, if you couldn't get to the Holy Land, you might go to Rome instead, and there you could still walk in the footsteps of the apostles. In fact, the mosaic in the Church of Santa Pudenziana in Rome would show you what you would see if you could have gone to the Holy Land, that is, the skyline of Jerusalem. But what if you couldn't get to Rome? That's okay. You might go to a shrine that was closer to home. And eventually, the liturgy and the processions of Holy Week were reproduced in other places, not only in Rome, but in other cities as well. And they were reproduced in microcosm within a basilica or a monastery by placing icons of the holy sites in a circuit around the grounds or around the perimeter of the basilica. And there you have the Stations of the Cross. So even though not everyone can travel, you can think of the stations as a mini pilgrimage. And it all began in Jerusalem, spread from there by people like Egeria. So what's the takeaway from our brief introduction to Egeria? One of the things that we learned from her is that she was not concerned about learning more about the places mentioned in the Gospels simply for the purpose of understanding the Gospels better. That may be a secondary benefit, but it's not the primary reason for the pilgrimage. This is not a form of educational tourism. The primary purpose for Egeria's pilgrimage was to pray on holy ground and to receive the body and blood of Christ in the places where his body walked around and where his blood was spilled and where his body was raised. And so now you might think about how you can incorporate pilgrimage into the spiritual rhythm of your life. And again, not everyone can travel far from home, so a pilgrimage doesn't have to mean traveling all the way to Israel or Italy. There are holy places and shrines you can visit in your own home state or maybe in your community. Or maybe a pilgrimage for you is simply visiting the grave of a loved one. That would be to continue an ancient Christian tradition. Or maybe it's as close to home as the Stations of the Cross in your parish. Whatever it is to you, a pilgrimage means stepping away from the routine of regular life to meditate on the passion of Christ in a way that can become for you a kind of reboot or reset of priorities and spiritual disciplines, and then to try to bring that into a new rhythm of life that will become for you part of the ongoing pilgrimage, which is the Christian life. Next time on The Way of the Fathers, Pseudo Dionysius. Thanks for listening.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filii
Way of the Fathers is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings. Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. And the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.